So like most owners of an MV Agusta, I spend most of my life trying to figure out ways to work into whatever conversation I'm having, the fact that I own an MV Agusta. You may not know this, but Harley Davidson used to own MV Agusta, and in 2008 or 2009, they had to sell MV Agusta for about $1. Obviously, that's not a good thing, but MV Agusta is still around. And I start this video this way because Monday, October 13th, Polaris announced that they were gonna sell their motorcycle division, Indian Motorcycle. Indian is being sold to a private equity firm known as Carolwood LP. They're mostly a real estate private equity firm, it seems. Now, before I get into the meat and potatoes of the video, I just want to come out and say that I'm not happy about this. As much as I have talked about the fact that I'm, a fan of Harley Davidson and its products, and I work for a Harley Davidson dealership, the reality is that the people who work for Indian are regular people who have rent and mortgages and kids, and this is their job, and it's in a little more precarious position than it was before, and that makes me unhappy. I think competition's a good thing. So in general, I want to see Indian succeed because that means that Harley is going to be pushed harder. And anytime two companies compete with one another, the main beneficiary of that is the consumer. And as a consumer of motorcycles, that's important to me. And furthermore, some of my favorite memories of the last 5 years have been watching racing between Harley Davidson and Indian. And this puts the racing program of Indian in an uncertain light, and also the racing program of Harley, because if they don't have a strong rivalry, then a lot of the spectacle of that sport goes away. And it's gonna be harder for Harley to justify racing baggers when it's just them. But I also don't wanna go too far in the opposite direction and make it sound like I think a whole bunch of things are going to change. I can't predict the future, and maybe nothing will change outside of their ownership. Now, there's already a lot of videos on the internet covering this topic, but I was kind of disappointed in the quality of most of these videos. Some other videos are very positive about what's going to happen. And I'm not saying that that's inherently false, but for most people, when they purchase a motorcycle, they plan to keep it for a significant number of years. And if the company that made the motorcycle is no longer in business, you're gonna have serious issues trying to get parts for it. The value of the motorcycle is gonna drop significantly. And trying to find someone who's gonna be able to repair the bike is obviously gonna be more difficult. And if you paint a very rosy picture and it doesn't go as well as you indicated, there might be people who have spent tens of thousands of dollars who end up losing out of it. When I first heard the news, I thought there were 3 or 4 possible explanations. The first and most obvious explanation would be that Indian isn't doing very well. Polaris has decided to throw in the towel, and they're selling Indian because it's performing poorly. The second possibility is that Indian is actually doing very well, and Polaris's core business, their off-road and marine divisions, are actually not performing well, in which case they might be selling Indian in order to generate cash to invest into their less profitable divisions, but that represent a larger portion of their core business, because Indian represents probably less than 10% of the overall business profile of Polaris. And so if you have a valuable asset, you might choose to sell it so that you could focus again on your core product. The third option is that both Polaris's core products, its off-road division, and Indian were both doing poorly, and it needed to jettison one to shore up its investors, its stockholders, and to free up R&D to invest into its primary business. And so it didn't really want to do it, but it had to get rid of it in order to solidify the business. And thinking through all these things, obviously the first thing I wanted to do was to check the quarterly statements of Polaris. They're a publicly traded company. You can go to their website and download their quarterly statements and see for yourself what they're saying about the business. And I've linked that down in the description if you don't want to look it up yourself on Google. But what I found paints a lot less of a rosy picture than what someone like Blockhead was painting for his viewers. In 2024, Indian Motorcycle was down. It's tough to know by exactly how much because they lump Indian in with the rest of their on-road division, but they specifically name Indian as underperforming in 2024. In the first 6 months of 2025, Polaris actually posted a loss, and they devalued Indian Motorcycle by $52.6 million, according to their quarterly report. They did this through what's called a goodwill impairment. So they corrected Indian's value by $52 million because the carrying value, i.e. the stated value of the company on their own books, didn't match what the fair value is, which is basically the market value of the company if you decided to sell it. And in 2024, it's pretty clear that they were suspicious that might be the case as well. They said basically if they didn't have a really good 2025 or start to 2025, that they were probably going to have to devalue Indian Motorcycle on their books. The direct quote from them is, "The estimated fair values for the on-road and marine reporting units are particularly dependent upon industries to strengthen, which will provide improved sales, margin expansion, and cash flow growth." Because obviously they ended up selling Indian and they did a goodwill impairment, it's pretty clear that these things did not happen. And it's no surprise. Obviously Harley's sales are also down. KTM almost went out of business. It's not a good year for motorcycles, but again, this just paints a lot less of a rosy picture than what was being talked about in Blockhead and some other people's videos. So to recap, Indian didn't have a good 2024, and then they aren't having a good 2025, and now Polaris is selling them because the company as a whole is currently losing money. Now, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. None of what I'm saying means that Indian's gonna go out of business or that they won't be successful 5 years from now. But it's certainly not what I would say is an unleashing of Indian or good news for Indian. Like, this is all very bad news. They were clearly heavily reliant upon funding from Polaris to keep their brand going, and now Polaris basically can't carry them anymore and is trying to recoup what they can from an asset while it still has some value. So what are some predictions we can make about Indian over the next few years, whether they end up being successful or not? So first and foremost, I think we're gonna have to see a reduction in some models. For context, Indian has more frames than Harley-Davidson, more engine platforms than Harley-Davidson, and competes with them in almost all their product segments outside of trike and adventure touring. And that's not a problem unless you're selling 1/5 the number of units, right? Which is what's happening with Indian most likely. Now, they don't state exactly how many bikes they sell, but most industry estimates put them at somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 units. But even if they're selling 40,000 units, you're kind of looking at something in the neighborhood of a quarter to maybe a fifth of what Harley moves. So you have significantly lower volume, but you're still trying to spend as much on R&D because you're trying to compete in just as many segments. And worse, you have 2-bagger motors and 2-bagger frames, which means you've got increased production costs and increased development costs because they build both the Power Plus and the Thunder Max. You've got a mid-size frame, just like Harley has with its Softail chassis. And you've also got your Sportster competitor in the form of the Scout. So that's 3 different engine varieties, like I said, and 4 different frame varieties when you're not selling as many bikes as Harley. And Harley has basically the Milwaukee 8 and the Rev Max, and they've got a bagger frame, a Softail frame, and then the Rev Max is obviously frameless, and so Harley can kind of use that as a modular platform, which again, saves money. This is a big part of why a lot of manufacturers are going to some form of parallel twin, because it lets them build a lot of different models with one core engine. It's really expensive to develop a lot of engines, and so Indian is gonna have to cut that down somehow. They might only offer Power Plus baggers or maybe only Thunder Max baggers, but they've got to figure out some way to cull their model lineup a little bit. And if they choose to go with just Power Plus baggers, kind of means that at some point the Chief is probably gonna be axed. And obviously the Scout is a pretty successful platform for them, so I can't imagine them getting rid of that. In addition to culling models, I think you're gonna have to be a little bit more choosy with your R&D. You're gonna have to pick which models that you invest heavily in and keep really competitive and up to date, and what models are basically gonna get the Gixxer 600 treatment, where you haven't changed something since 2013, but it still passes regulations and it doesn't cost you that much money to build it, so you just keep building it. So the development cycle of stuff is gonna be stretched out. That might not take effect immediately because lots of development things have multi-year long cycles, right? So they might have a completely normal 2026 launch, but every launch after that, you're probably going to notice the reduction of R&D and the refocusing of R&D into the most successful platforms. There's little things that they can do too, not offer as many colors, not offer as many SKUs. These are all things that are going to help them, but ultimately they're going to have to shrink their model lineup at least a little bit, because it's going to be really hard to offer a lot of competitive products over a broad range while selling significantly fewer units. There's other aspects of the business that might need to be cut as well. If your motor clothes division isn't doing well, You might want to whittle that down to just some really core key SKUs like a riding jacket, a couple of shirts kind of thing, instead of having such a broad range of products available. You might not be able to invest as much into the development of P&A. You might have to rely a little bit more heavily on the aftermarket. But again, as you sell fewer units, the aftermarket is not going to want to invest as much because obviously they have fewer opportunities to sell parts if you're not selling as many bikes or as many models. And ultimately, how successful Indian is at not losing market share while also reducing how much money they're spending on R&D, development, and manufacturing is going to be key to whether or not they're successful long term. So obviously, I can't predict the future, but those things, at least to me, seem like safe bets. And so while that's what Indian needs to do, what do you do if you already own an Indian or you're thinking about purchasing? Well, I think that you should go into it understanding that this company might not be there 5 years from now. And that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't buy their bike. It just means that that's something you need to account for. So hopefully you're either getting a very, very good deal on it, or you're not worried about parts availability, or maybe you only plan to keep the machine for 5 years anyways, and you're not really worried about taking a loss. You just want to buy it and enjoy it. Because in the short term, I don't think that they're going anywhere. But over the medium and long term, that definitely gets more and more of a concern. Now, as soon as someone mentions private equity firm, you're gonna get a whole bunch of comments saying that, hey, they're going out of business immediately. And that's not necessarily the case. Like, I'm not a big fan of private equity, but it's not an immediate death sentence for a company. I know that if I was in the market, it would make me think twice, especially with everything else that's going on in the world. I think the odds were kind of already stacked against a lot of motorcycle manufacturers, especially one that primarily builds bikes for the US market that are large displacement and quite expensive. And so it makes me nervous. Maybe you're not as nervous as me about it, but ultimately, I just wanted to give you some additional information that I didn't see being presented in a lot of other videos. The quarterly statements show that Indian needs to be turned around. It's not really something that's super healthy right now. And as much as it's not over for them, it's definitely something that needs a new direction. It needs new life being breathed into it. So I really just wanted to make sure that people had a slightly better understanding of what was going on than what they read in the press releases, because obviously press releases are always going to be flowery and try to spin things and put things in a good light. And if you watched videos that really only regurgitated that or that painted a rosy picture of what the future could look like, I wanted something that was a little bit more in the middle. Like I said, I own an MV Agusta. I own a bike from a brand that had to be sold for $1, right? And that company is still around and I can still get parts for my bike. So I'm not trying to scare someone, right? Like, I did the thing, right? So I'm not trying to say that it's all doom and gloom, but on the flip side, I think it's a little irresponsible to only present a rosy side to this. Anyways, as always, leave a comment if you enjoyed it, if you have any questions or any additional information, or if I got something wrong, because again, I'm not a financial expert, so don't trust exactly what I'm saying, obviously, without doing, your due diligence. But if I got something wrong, throw it down in the comment section and I can make a correction and I can pin your comment. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.